Hey everybody, this is a 1979 piece by Peter Beilharz titled Trotsky's Marxism, Permanent Involution? It says, although Bolshevism has been partially discredited, Trotsky has rarely been subjected to scrutiny, and Trotskyism remains influential within the Western left. Footnote, see the various essays in Telos. See Claudine Orondo, Lenin and the Cultural Revolution, published in 1977, M. Liebman's Leninism under Lenin, published in 1975. The entire tradition of council communism is, of course, also against Bolshevism. See, for example, Serge Bruckner's edited volume, Pannekoek and the Workers' Councils, published in 1978. Recent attempts to save Lenin have failed to establish that his theory is not, in most respects, pre-Marxist. See, for example, J. Hoffman, Marxism and the Theory of Praxis, published in 1975, D. Rubin, Marxism and Materialism, published in 1977. The most elementary defense is Neil Harding's Lenin's Political Thought. Ignoring two tactics, Harding discovers that Lenin was not a Jacobin nor a populist, but a Marxist who analyzed specificities. Exclamation point. Next footnote. Two good critiques of Trotsky are either brief or partial. G. Hodgson, Trotsky and Fatalistic Marxism, published in 1975, and P. Thompson and G. Lewis, The Revolution Unfinished, a Critique of Trotskyism. End footnote. In fact, Trotsky epitomizes the worst elements of orthodox Marxism. Trotsky's development falls into four phases: pre-Bolshevism till 1917, ultra-Bolshevism 1917 to 23, defensive Bolshevism 1923 to 38, and incipient post-Bolshevism 1938 to 40. Trotsky theorizes permanent revolution in the first period, inserting the party into it in the second, and casting some doubts on his entire life's work in the final period. In the USSR in war, and in some sections of his biography of Stalin, Trotsky almost breaks with orthodoxy. Even in The Revolution Betrayed, there are doubts which were certainly absent from his earlier writings as left oppositionist. This late tension between orthodoxy and criticism in Trotsky is not clearly resolved. The history of Trotskyism subsequent to 1940 shows that critical perspectives were to be suppressed. Marx's beard was not to be trimmed, let alone his thought refurbished. Footnote. The unity which the late Trotsky sought with Shachtman was strategic. Trotsky gave his organizational support to Cannon and the orthodox against, quote, petty bourgeois tendencies of the opposition, end quote. But so ambivalent is Trotsky's late position that even while he is rethinking the status of the Soviet Union, he is formally reinforcing dialectical materialism, reciting his ABCs, quote, in defense of Marxism, end quote, and aligning himself with the orthodox in the Socialist Workers' Party. End footnote. In epistemology, both Lenin and Trotsky follow anti-Düring. They pride themselves in possessing a materialism which is an advance over 18th century mechanical materialism. For Trotsky, quote, our thought, including dialectical thought, is only one of the forms of changing matter, end quote. Like Lenin, Trotsky thinks that matter produces revolution, succumbing to the grossest voluntarism when revolution is not forthcoming. But this is not to say that Trotsky's epistemology is completely vulgar. Trotsky attacks sensualism because molecular reality is intangible. In fact, he includes waves, electricity, and so on in the realm of materiality, endorsing the theses of materialism and imperial criticism. See a piece called Radioactivity and Materialism in Isaac Deutscher's edited volume, The Age of Permanent Revolution. Buick oversimplifies matters when he accuses Trotsky of 18th century mechanistic materialism. For Trotsky makes clear that, quote, tangibility, end quote, is to be scientifically and not sensually understood. See Adam Buick's Josef Dietzken, Radical Philosophy 10, page 7, number 22. I have pieces from Adam Buick on this channel, and I have at least one critique of Isaac Deutscher on this channel, but I do not have anything by Isaac Deutscher himself. And if you don't know, I have Peter Beilharz's entire book on Trotskyism on this channel. Trotsky's mistake is rather in accepting the orthodox division between men and matter. Footnote. Deutscher. I don't know if that's actually a quote or whatever, it's a citation. Deutscher, page 352. Mind is a derivative faculty. The best it can achieve, so end footnote, mind is a derivative faculty. The best mind can achieve, dialectical thought, correlates only with a moving picture of empirical reality. Footnote, see Z. Jordan, The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, published in London, 1967. I'm actually reading that book now as a side interest. See Trotsky, My Life, published in 1975. I think that was originally from 1930. I think he wrote that in when he was in Turkey, Principo, or however you pronounce it. Compare another student of Labriola, Gramsci, Prison Notebooks. End footnote. In fundamentals, Trotsky's epistemology does not differ from Lenin's reflectionism. Like Lenin, Trotsky is caught in the dominant Second International tendency to view Marxism and natural science as converging or as united in the first place. From Labriola, a progressive thinker in the context of the Second International, Trotsky takes only what he needs, the positivist, materialist current uniting Saint-Simon and Marx. In one text, we find Trotsky postulating the essential similarity between chemical and astronomical discovery and the analysis of social affairs. Neptune is not understood as a production. Dude, I'm messing this thing up. In one text, we find Trotsky postulating the essential similarity between chemical and astronomical discovery and the analysis of social affairs. Knowledge is not understood as a production. Trotsky parallels the discovery of Neptune and the analysis of the Paris Commune, the discovery of phlogiston with that of the, quote, soul, end quote, and Marx with Mendeleev. Trotsky reduces psychology to physiology and physiology to chemistry, mechanics, and physics. See dialectical materialism and science in Deutscher. End footnote. Trotsky reduces all social and human affairs to materiality, and Trotsky reduces all social and human affairs to materiality, as Trotsky understands materiality, and thus concludes with an unqualified endorsement of Pavlov. Footnote. Elsewhere, Trotsky is less adamant. In another place, Trotsky is anxious to establish that Freud and Pavlov are not incompatible. See his Cultural and Socialism. See also Literature and Revolution, published in English at least, in Ann Arbor in 1971, page 220. Cynics may note that the working class eventually became Pavlov's dog. Shortage of text restricts further comment here. The only other relevant text known of is unavailable. In Trotsky's Diary in Exile of 1935, he refers to an article on the, quote, interrelationship between the physiological determinism of brain processes and the, quote, autonomy, end quote, of thought, which is subject to the laws of logic, end quote. This article has not been traced. End footnote. In this context, Mavrakis has noted that Trotsky understood Marx's method in Capital as a vain display of philosophical pedantry. Footnote. See K. Mavrakis on Trotskyism. Be aware that that text is a Stalinist critique of Trotskyism. End footnote. Trotsky claims to reject general categories. For him, quote, only vulgar thought operates with such concepts as capitalism, morals, freedom, worker state, etc., as fixed abstractions, presuming that capitalism is equal to capitalism, morals are equal to morals, etc., end quote. Footnote. In Defense of Marxism, page 50, see Results and Prospects in Permanent Revolution. The relevance of the metaphor of equivalence is unclear. On this basis, state capitalism is a quite acceptable notion. End footnote. Trotsky glosses over the problem of categories, quote, in general, end quote. Do we use them or not? Where do they come from? Are they all equally useful? According to his position, capital itself, the book, or any sustained piece of theory is vulgar, for it is a critical analysis of capital, quote, in general, end quote. Like Lenin, Trotsky tends to fetishize historical specificity, equating real and thought objects by suggesting that real objects can be known, quote, as it is, end quote. Marx's categories are discarded in the process of what may be called conjuncturalism, yet ideological categories are let in the back door. New section. Trotsky's general theory of history. The theory of, quote, permanent revolution, end quote, was conceived through the collaboration of Parvis and Trotsky around 1905, though the theory itself, as known today, is essentially Trotsky's. From Parvis, Trotsky took two general observations on the nature of contemporary history. First, the internationalization of capital, and second, the obsolescence of the nation-state. In Trotsky's earlier elaboration of his theory, these observations are incorporated into an orthodox economistic schematism. As a force of production, international capital breaks through the relations of the national state. This is the basis of one half of the theory of permanent revolution, a functional internationalism. For Trotsky, internationalism, quote, is no abstract principle, but a theoretical and political reflection of the character of the world economy, end quote. The other aspect of the theory of permanent revolution is the telescoping of the two traditional revolutions, bourgeois and proletarian. For Trotsky, the Russian Revolution is bourgeois in that its immediate, historical tasks are bourgeois, yet its personnel is, quote, proletarian, end quote, and the logic of proletarian power is socialist revolution. This was not Parvis's position. His insistence on the necessity of an interim regime was closer to Lenin than to Trotsky. Revolution is therefore permanent because it begins as bourgeois but cannot be completed as such. Footnote. An obvious protest here concerns the possibility of a so-called, quote, third way, end quote, bureaucratic collectivism, etc. There's some footnotes that I missed. Footnote, see Results and Prospects, page 37. Like Lenin, Trotsky fluctuates here between automatism and voluntarism. Next footnote. See Permanent Revolution, page 133. On a logical level, this is an unobjectionable position to some extent, prefiguring the recent work of Emmanuel and Amin on the question of world exchange and accumulation, though it is informative to note that, like Amin et al., Trotsky underestimates national specificities. Trotsky's position is quite simple. In a world capitalist system, socialism in one country is a logical impossibility. So, back to the text. Revolution is therefore permanent because it begins as bourgeois but cannot be completed as bourgeois. This second aspect of Trotsky's theory is by no means as inoffensive as the first. The initial problem is that Trotsky virtually dismisses objective conjunctural features, arguing that the nature of revolutionary personnel determines the revolutionary outcome. Associated with this mistake is a general tendency to fail to differentiate between the, quote, elements, end quote, of revolution. Given Trotsky's basic understanding of socialism as nationalization, a process of conflating the two, quote, stages, end quote, is inevitable. Trotsky assumes that proletarian revolution as democratic revolution can solve the problems of two revolutions. Footnote. Trotsky's attempt to root, quote, permanent revolution, end quote, in Marx's work is insubstantial. Marx toys with this voluntaristic idea around 1848, only to reject it, returning to the study of objective structures the better to understand the relation between subject and object, erring now in favor of the latter. End footnote. But the crux of the matter here is not whether there are, quote, are two, quote, stages, end quote. It is where the bourgeois culture prerequisite for socialist revolution comes from and how long it takes to permeate social life. In Trotsky's scheme, we can barely tell when bourgeois revolution becomes socialist. As in Lenin, men presumably become socialist after the revolution. Why does Trotsky insist that bourgeois revolutions inevitably become proletarian? The underpinning notion here is an economistic maxim. Quote, "The time for socialism is always ripe," end quote. As Hodgson puts it, permanent revolution is premised on the principle of permanent collapse. The economic base has done its work. The capitalist mode has nowhere to go but to the scrap heap. World economy is ripe for revolution, and individual nations are subject to ripeness via the mediation of uneven development. Trotsky, however, misuses the principle of uneven development as a political tool. Trotsky assumes that uneven development has a leveling effect, homogenizing the world so that all situations become the same, i.e. revolutionary. He understands the presence of imperialism outside the center as symbolizing a cultural leap for the periphery into a bourgeois era. But the victims of imperialism experience the negative aspects of bourgeois culture without necessarily gaining the positive ones. Trotsky, however, postulates a kind of inverted domino theory dependent on the universality of capital. Where capital intrudes, there the bed of socialist revolution is laid. Consequently, Trotsky understands the present revolutionary epoch as a continually revolutionary situation. He sees the entire 20th century as one massive conjuncture. Trotsky's notion of combined development is problematic. It is actually derived from uneven development. The combination injects a teleology and becomes a prime mover. But though, quote, combined development, end quote, may explain the rapid growth of West Germany or the so-called, quote, Italian miracle, end quote, it says nothing in terms of revolutionary culture or political possibilities, only in an economistic framework where culture can be, quote, read off, end quote, does combined development take on teleological powers. For in cultural terms, combined development means chaos, i.e. unevenness. Combined development as a theoretical motor is vacuous, or at best circular. To base a theory on the notion that discontinuity becomes a prime mover is absurd. A break is a break, not a leap. Uneven development implies fragmentation, not great leaps forward. Trotsky's only excuse here is that his concept of combined development is more or less pre-theoretical. A few words in the history of the Russian Revolution have been hypostatized by Trotsky's followers into a first principle. Footnote. History of the Russian Revolution, published in London, 1967, Volume 1. See also the excellent analysis in the seminal work by Baruch Knai Paz, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. End footnote. Trotsky's theory of history is lacking in its treatment of both objective and subjective factors. He understands the objective-subjective couple only as a base superstructure couple. An ideologically assumed economic crisis, objective, determines a political crisis which is resolved by the intervention of the party, subjective. Trotsky's theory is therefore simultaneously voluntarist and determinist. Voluntarist because Trotsky's theories, conjunctural readings, are inaccurate, and determinist because of its causal crisis, the consciousness link. Footnote. See Hodgson. And in Permanent Revolution, Trotsky identifies, quote, subjective with, quote, party. D. Avanos makes the same point in Trotsky's Marxism, in a piece titled Trotsky's Marxism. For a philosophical reading, see Dunayevskaya, Leon Trotsky as Man and Theoretician, published in Studies in Comparative Communism. That piece by Raya Dunayevskaya, Leon Trotsky as Man and Theoretician, is on the channel. In Results and Footnote. In Results and Prospects, Trotsky details his analysis of the prerequisites for socialism, i.e., the objective aspect. In any given country, there must be higher productivity in large capitals than in small. There must be higher productivity in large capitals than in small. There must be rapid economic growth and therefore expansion of the proletariat. On the political level, there must be growth culminating in proletarian dictatorship. Trotsky, like Lenin in the development of capitalism in Russia, sees rate of growth as the determinant of ripeness. He concludes inevitably that the time is ripe, for there would be few countries to which the above scenario would be completely inapplicable. Uneven development becomes the rationalization for the few possible exceptions. They can be, quote, carried along, end quote, so the entire world is in an objectively revolutionary situation. In his Manifesto on the Imperialist War and the Proletarian Revolution, Trotsky defines a revolutionary situation as a situation in which there is a divided bourgeoisie, a similar petty bourgeoisie, proletarian malaise, and a revolutionary party. Like Lenin, Trotsky does not differentiate between social crisis and revolutionary situation. The bogus economic crisis, which Trotsky claims to be a fixed characteristic of all post-First War capitalism, is merely a supplementary factor. Trotsky's theory of the subjective aspect is even more suspect. By 1938, when Trotsky drafts the transitional program of the Fourth International, Trotsky announces that, quote, the world political situation as a whole is chiefly characterized by a historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat, The objective prerequisites for the proletarian revolution have not only ripened, end quote, they have even begun to get somewhat rotten. The turn is now to the proletariat, i.e., chiefly to the proletariat's revolutionary vanguard. The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership, end quote. Trotsky, Transitional Program. Footnote. In Deutscher's anthology, Writings 1939, Left-Wing Communism, see also Whither France in the piece, What is a Revolutionary Situation? From the writings of 1930 to 31, Trotsky's understanding is more qualified than Lenin's, but it is still essentially economist. Consciousness is produced by crisis, in a response to crisis. In Trotsky's vague understanding of relative autonomy, subject still equals party. See also the qualified economism, similar to that of the later Engels in writings 1930 to 31. End footnote. Trotsky's crisis is not in the working class. Its, quote, consciousness, end quote, presents no problem. Clearly, Trotsky has no notion of subjectivity. He sees only, quote, objective, end quote, interests, socialism. The workers could not possibly, quote, betray themselves, end quote. Therefore, they must be misled. Here enters not only a fetish of leadership, but also a concomitant workerism. Footnote. Note also Trotsky's comments on fascism, quote, Hitler's, quote, ideology, end quote, never seriously gripped the workers, end quote. Trotsky's thinking here resembles Michel's objectivism. Both hypostatize the imputed interest of the working class. End footnote. One source of Trotsky's erroneous revolutionary optimism seems to be his Enlightenment concept of human nature. In his view, people are, quote, essentially, end quote, good, revolutionary, but are prevented from self-realization by institutional repression. There's also comments in Trotsky to the opposite effect, that human beings are inherently lazy. So just have that in mind. Lenin's vehement attack on the bourgeois state reveals a similar disposition. Neither of these positions, however, has much in common with Marx, for whom, quote, all history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature, end quote. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy, end footnote. Marx's position may be that men are capable of being good, but it is not that they are would-be revolutionaries merely subjugated by a wicked bourgeoisie. Men may become revolutionary, but this is possible only via consciousness raising through transformative practice. For Trotsky, mass consciousness is not such a problem at all. Trotsky elevates leadership to the level of a final determinant. The party almost becomes an ethical value, and here enters elitism and eventually substitutionism. Footnote: this error is not identical to Lenin's. Lenin's partyism emerges as the compensatory force given insufficient objective conditions. For Trotsky, objective conditions are ripe. Lenin's mistake is practical. Trotsky's theoretical. Dunayevskaya's piece, Leon Trotsky, explains Trotsky's fetishism by reference to his failure to thrash out the issue of the party over a period of years. End footnote. In the event of the failure of his idealized proletariat to rise to great heights, Trotsky returns to the domain of the, quote, great man, end quote. In his diary, he observes, for example, that Lenin alone was responsible for October. See Trotsky's Diary in Exile. It does not occur to Trotsky that such a situation might indicate revolutionary prematurity, or conversely that given adequate ferment, the working class itself might break through a leadership impasse. Trotsky's theory takes its final trajectory into mainstream history. Footnote: see E. H. Carr, What is History? End footnote. Socialist man becomes Superman. Quote, the average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, and above this ridge new peaks will rise, end quote. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Trotsky's scenario is an intellectual utopia lacking even the balance of Marx's vision in the German ideology, where men still live as simultaneously physical and intellectual beings. Further, Trotsky's supermen can be no different to Nietzsche's. Not all men can be Superman. See Nietzsche's Will to Power. The, quote, higher species, end quote, exists only at the cost of the, quote, lower species, end quote, a paradox completely foreign to the ethic of socialism, if not to the problems of the USSR. In summary, Trotsky's revolutionary situation is built on minimum conditions which are not adequate for self-willed human progress. As a rationale for making, quote, socialism, end quote, in backward countries, the theory of permanent revolution does violence to the basic principles of historical materialism. Trotsky's revolution is largely a tactical affair, an act in the superstructure enabling a change in property form. Trotsky's revolution is largely a tactical affair, an act in the superstructure enabling a change in property form. Here we are a long way from Marx's theory and from the conditions which prompted its genesis. One characteristic of Trotsky's theory is the role of analogy as the method typical of the, quote, educated, end quote, Philistine. Surprisingly, we find a partiality for analogy in his own work. Trotsky can only understand China as a Russian replay. Footnote: Trotsky can, of course, only understand all non-fascist situations, as Russian replays, but we have as yet an insufficient basis to argue this. End footnote. Even more serious is his consistent use of the French Revolution as a historical analogy. Trotsky does not distinguish between bourgeois and proletarian revolutions on the historical plane either. Trotsky assumes the necessary break prompted by the development of free labor to be parallel to socialist revolution, which is in an unprecedented manner an affair of mass will. Footnote, see Karl Marx's Grundrisse. Bourgeois revolution is the last act legalizing subterranean developments in the social formation, the blossoming dominance of the capitalist mode, hegemony of the towns and industrial capital, and so on. Socialist revolution presupposes objective developments, but is in no way ensured by objective developments, for its object is not the replacement of private property and land with private property and capital, but the abolition of capital as a social power and the creation of a new society by new men and women. An associated error of Trotsky's here is a political determinism similar to Lenin's. Trotsky thinks that a bourgeois revolution proper must be introduced by the bourgeoisie. He understands the role of objective forces. Trotsky thinks that a bourgeois revolution proper must be introduced by the bourgeoisie. Trotsky understates the role of objective forces. See Permanent Revolution and the Class Nature of the Soviet State. Trotsky fails to understand the bourgeoisie as representatives, bearers of bourgeois social forces, rather than vice versa. For as Beilharz puts it, the bourgeois revolution sweeps the bourgeoisie into power, not the other way around. See Beilharz, Political Power and Social Classes. Trotsky cannot conceive that capitalism can exist without the bourgeoisie in its classical form. That is, that the fate of the Russian Revolution may be inscribed in its objective forces and not determined by its, quote, proletarian, end quote, leadership. Footnote. See, for example, Hindis, Hurst, Cutler, and Hussein, Marx's Capital and Capitalism Today, Volume 1, Chapter 5, Part 3. End footnote. In this regard, Trotsky's method is closer to idealism than to historical materialism. The theory of permanent revolution, based on a political conflation, betrays also an epistemological conflation. Everything tends to become everything else. Everything becomes possible given socialist intention, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and Trotsky, like Lenin, is felled from behind by the, quote, ruse of history, end quote. Working class movement, the, quote, ruse of history, end quote. New section. Trotsky's theory of history and action. It is widely acknowledged that Trotsky's voice was that of a prophet in a working class movement confronted with nascent German fascism. Trotsky's 1930 to 33 analyses of Germany and the Comintern were uniquely apt, even if more foresightful than insightful. Though sharing the Comintern's economism, Trotsky understands the falsity of the, quote, third period, end quote, prognosis, given the defeats in Britain and China. He disputes the idiocy of, quote, social fascism, end quote, predicts the victory of Hitler, the pursuant Holocaust, the attack on the USSR, and the death of the Comintern. kind of sloppy use of the Holocaust in here, because Trotsky definitely didn't predict the Holocaust. He pursued by Holocaust is meant like something akin to Barbarossa. Yeah, he did anticipate that, but not the Holocaust. Poor word choice. But this is not to say that Trotsky's analysis of Germany was flawless. Central to Trotsky's analysis is the problem of leadership. Germany in 1930 is, Trotsky says, an objectively ripe revolutionary situation. The situation is ripe for socialist revolution or for fascism, the final determinant being the position taken by the petty bourgeoisie. Trotsky postulates a socialism or barbarism alternative, which he illustrates as the, quote, Russian way, end quote, or the, quote, Italian way, end quote. Revolutionary optimism shows through. Fascism is a response to nascent socialist revolution. The working class defensive against fascism signals the approaching offensive. Footnote: Palancis, Fascism and Dictatorship, and Trotsky, the Third International after Lenin, and Laclau, Politics and Ideology in Marxist Theory. End footnote. Trotsky's position on Italy, that fascism is the punishment for failed revolutionaries, is similar to his position on Germany and equally mistaken. Footnote: Trotsky's error here is not exceptional, but the common view. End footnote. An associated error is his idealization of the proletariat. Not until 1933 will Trotsky acknowledge that fascism has a, quote, proletarian, end quote, base. Trotsky acknowledges only that it is permeating the upper and lower extremities of the proletariat, since its core is, quote, naturally, end quote, socialist. Footnote: After 1933, Trotsky acknowledged that workers may support fascism through political indifference. End footnote. Trotsky's analysis of France in the period following the emergence of Nazism is also structured in the format of Italian or Russian alternatives. France is headed in the former direction and needs to be turned to the latter direction. France and Germany seem to be separated only by a degree of development. In other words, Trotsky seems to suggest a Bonapartism, fascist continuum. Whither France is permeated with a socialism or barbarism scenario, the logic of which militates against Trotsky's position on social fascism. Unlike his writings on Germany, those on France are not characterized by a clear distinction between Bonapartism and fascism. French fascism, of course, failed to develop, as did French socialism, Trotsky's analysis of the, quote, revolutionary situation, end quote, notwithstanding. See Whither France. Note the title of the last essay, quote, The French Revolution Has Begun, end quote. This volume was printed in response to the French May. In 1968, Mandel, Lessons of May 1968, paralleled 1936 and 1968 as Revolutions Betrayed. More recently, Mandel has changed his mind. Neither were revolutionary situations. Trotsky was, quote, wrong. End footnote. As already mentioned, Trotsky regarded Italian fascism as something of a providential punishment for those who failed to carry through the tasks of the Italian Revolution. The year 1920 must therefore have provided a revolutionary situation. If it did not, Trotsky's, quote, analysis is a non sequitur. Trotsky's diagnosis that the Italian Revolution was in 1920, quote, an actual fact, end quote, is regarded by few with such certainty. As one major historian puts it, quote, one of the classic conditions for revolution, the decision of the masses to make it, was critically subject to dislocations, to uneven development and organization, maturity, homogeneity, and ideology, which were to prove no less significant in the struggle against squadrism during 1921 to 22, end quote. That's from P. Spriano, The Occupation of the Factories, published in 1975. See also Gramsci's Political Writings, 1910 to 20, and see also Sergio Bologna's Class Composition and the Theory of the Party. End footnote. As is often the case in this history of the working class movement, we are caught in the netherworld between, quote, revolt and, quote, the netherworld of between, quote, revolt and, quote, revolution. Trotsky's analysis of Britain figures as something of a prediction for the British Revolution, the latter taking the form of the 1926 general strike. The strike clearly indicates to Trotsky a revolutionary situation restricted by retrograde leaders. For Trotsky, the British Revolution would have been successful, quote, in the course of a few weeks, end quote, given adequate leadership. For the British proletariat, revolutionary in its millions, had been held back thus far by the bourgeoisie and its Fabian agents. See Where is Britain Going? And the 3 volumes of Trotsky's writings on Britain. End footnote. But again, to leap from the fact of the general strike, quote, to assuming that Britain, was on the brink of a revolutionary crisis, that the failure of the Communist Party to give a, quote, correct, end quote, lead crippled the imminent revolutionary potential of the strike, reveals a profound failure to comprehend the realities of the working class consciousness, end quote. Footnote. See J. Hinton and R. Hyman, Trade Unions and Revolution, the Industrial Politics of the Early Communist Party of Great Britain. End footnote. Trotsky's analysis of Britain reveals a classic misunderstanding of militancy as revolutionary fervor, locating the real problem not at the level of mass consciousness, but that of leadership. Revolutions which do not exist in the minds of the masses can hardly be said to be betrayed. Footnote. See again Laclau's penetrating analysis in the 3rd chapter of Politics and Ideology in Marxist Theory. End footnote. Spain, it seems, was potentially the socialist revolution of the 20th century. Claudine's recent authoritative work confirms Trotsky's analysis here, that Spain was a thoroughly revolutionary situation, even one of an unprecedented type. See footnote. See F. Claudine, The Communist Movement. End footnote. Spain fully fitted Trotsky's socialism barbarism scheme, but the weight of foreign intervention and incorrect tactics on a local and world scale saw the victory of the latter. Footnote. See The Spanish Revolution, 1931-39, published New York, 1973. I'm guessing that's by Trotsky. I don't know. The nature of the, quote, socialism postulated in this couple is unclear. According to Claudine, a uniquely Spanish pluralist socialism was possible, whereas the nature of communism during the purge period would suggest a one-party state. In the latter case, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote, should read, quote, state capitalism or fascism, end quote. End footnote. Trotsky's analysis of Spain is similar to that of Germany. Again, his analysis of the Comintern and internal tactics are incisive. Again, the problem of leadership is given central focus. Trotsky concentrates on the party which was not present, the party of the Fourth International. He views that party as a panacea in the face of whom, quote, treachery, end quote. Rather than castigating communist betrayal, Trotsky emphasizes the inability of POUM to provide Bolshevik leadership. Trotsky's understanding precludes the kind of left coalition which Claudine points to as a desirable possibility. Generally, Trotsky universalizes the socialism-barbarism couple, which is quite apt in some conjunctures, but does not fit others at all. His ability to differentiate between Bonapartism and fascism is limited to cases in which fascism is actually ripening. Otherwise, he presumes bourgeois democracy to be completely played out, which is blatantly not the case. It becomes clear that Trotsky's socialism-barbarism couple rests on the general theory of imminent revolution. Despite his own methodological provisos, Trotsky in some cases, quote, dissolves the momentary situation within the general perspective, end quote, crediting one or two factors, leadership, party, with determining powers. Mavrakis' contention that Trotsky never studies a conjuncture in its specificity has been refuted. Again, Mavrakis being like a Greek Stalinist. Or I believe he was a Greek Stalinist. I might be talking to my ass, but I think he's a Greek Stalinist, and his book was translated on, I can't remember what it's called. It's called something like On Trotskyism or something like that. It was translated into English from French. Mavrakis' contention that Trotsky never studies a conjuncture in its specificity has been refuted. Trotsky analyzes two basic conjunctures, Russia and Germany, and reads all other situations ideologically through this grid. The rectitude of his Spanish and German analyses is the reverse side of his ideological and irrelevant analyses of bourgeois democracies. This condition is directly related to the irrelevance of Trotskyism for the West today. For, quote, the most dangerous thing in politics is to become a prisoner of your own formula, end quote. Trotsky, according to Arne Swabek, in Visiting Principio, which was in Studies in Comparative Communism. New section. Trotsky's schizoid socialism. As a means of entry to this area, it is appropriate to mention Trotsky's lived record, and in particular his understanding of socialism as reflected in his practice. Of course, Trotsky is widely known as an authoritarian. His early organizational radicalism, particularly the famous and remarkable insight into substitutionism, is often overlooked, though there have been some recent attempts to cast him as a Luxemburgist gone wrong. Footnote, see, for example, Carlo. I'm assuming that's Antonio Carlo, who had a kind of a bureaucratic collectivist theory of the USSR that he borrowed from Bruno Rizzi. But Carlo has this piece that says, see Carlo's Trotsky and the Organization Problem, published in Critique 7. That's actually in a book titled The Ideas of Leon Trotsky, which is like a collection of books from the journal Critique, from various authors. I have a few of them on the channel, but particularly ones by Hillel Tikhtin on the Russian question. But that book has a bunch of various excerpts from that. Has a bunch of texts that were originally published in that journal. It says, see, Kanai Paz gives a generous preface of the rare 1904 text, Our Political Tasks, in The Social and Political Thought of Trotsky. I've been reading that book. I haven't finished it. Kanai Paz argues that there are here elements of a prefigurative critique of Bolshevism. The theorization of permanent revolution with its necessary telescoping negates these mass perspectives. End footnote. Such attempts to state, quote, save, end quote, Trotsky come into difficulty when they come up against Trotsky's record after 1917. His performance in the handling of the Kronstadt Rising, the, quote, militarization of labor, end quote, his endorsement of Taylorism, his attitude to Soviets and so on, can all be taken as symptoms of etatism. Footnote. See P. Average, Kronstadt, 1921. See R. Pethybridge, Social Prelude to Stalinism, published 1974. Trotsky's Revolution Betrayed. Gramsci's Prison Notebooks, and Trotsky, If America Should Go Communist, in Deutscher's Anthology. See Maurice Brinton, The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. I actually have that entire book on this channel, so you can listen to that if your heart so desires. And footnote. This and other texts like Terrorism and Communism indicate a complete, if conjuncturally, quote, determined, end quote, victory for the compulsion principle, giving fuel to writers like Solzhenitsyn. I can never pronounce that guy's name right. Trotsky's record clearly negates his early organizational radicalism. It might be suggested, however, that this, quote, negation, end quote, takes the form not of obliteration but of repression, creating a surplus that emerges in the intellectualism of literature and revolution. If Trotsky's practice in political theory already suggests the presence of a bourgeois concept of socialism, the place given to ethics is no more impressive. According to Trotsky, quote, the most popular ... accusation directed against Bolshevik, quote, amoralism, end quote, bases itself on the so-called Jesuitical maxim of Bolshevism. The ends justifies the means. Where am I? Sorry. Footnote. Ends and means of morality, which is featured in Deutscher's anthology. End footnote. Trotsky disappears into situation ethics. One may shoot a mad dog but not commit murder. He eludes the problem of the person, e.g. the Kronstadt rebel, whom the state deems a, quote, mad dog, end quote. The problem of moral arbiter is overpassed, quote, that is permissible, ... which really leads to the liberation of mankind, end quote. Trotsky. To the obvious retort, who is to decide, comes the answer, the party. Quote, in the last analysis, the party is always right, because the party is the sole historical instrument that the working class possesses for the solution of its fundamental tasks. No one can be right against the party, ... With historic justification, we can say, my party, right or wrong. End quote. Trotsky. Speech to the 13th Party Congress, May 26, 1924. Featured in Trotsky, The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1923-25. The Pathfinder translation has, quote, right or wrong, ... this is my party, end quote. All other translations, Serge, Sedova, Knypaz, Carmichael, have, quote, my party, right or wrong, end quote. End footnote. Quote, there can be no contradiction between personal morality and the interests of the party, since the party combines ... the very highest tasks and aims of mankind, end quote. Trotsky is a moral democratic centrist. Trotsky is a moral democratic centralist. Through the party, he espouses a positivity of truth. Where ethics are given a place, ethics are those not of socialism but of the French Revolution. Like Lenin, Trotsky's ethics are those of Jacobinism. See Trotsky's writings 1936-37 and Lenin's collected works, volume 25. End footnote. The party becomes not only the absolute moral arbiter, but also something of an ethic in itself. He who theorized substitution in 1904 allows its rationalization 20 years on. Clearly, one of Trotsky's concepts of socialism relates to the Soviet Union. Given Trotsky's internationalism, the USSR cannot be more than a transitional regime. Internal factors such as low productivity reinforce this transitional status. Socialism must by definition have a higher development of productive forces than late capitalism. Footnote. My presentation here is filleted of some of Trotsky's ambiguities. The Russian state is socialist, but society is not. in the writings 1932 to 33, and nationalization itself ensures not only the plan but also social economy and so on. End footnote. In the central ninth chapter of Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky defines the USSR as, quote, essentially, end quote, socialist. The Soviet Union is a worker state because of the production relations introduced in October. There is no bourgeoisie, therefore there is no ruling class. Sorry, one of those invasive species just jumped on the table and I had to give it a quick pounce, but I don't think I got it. So I just flicked it away. But I want to repeat that. There is no bourgeoisie, therefore there is no ruling class. There is no bourgeoisie, therefore there is no ruling class. Footnote. The class nature of the USSR was subject to debate as early as 1930. Trotsky's position is certainly not ill-considered. Note, however, that the level of these debates is always, quote, find the bourgeoisie, end quote, not, quote, detect bourgeois social relations, end quote. Note, however, that the level of these debates is always, quote, find the bourgeoisie, end quote, not, quote, detect bourgeois social relations, end quote. End footnote. Trotsky's criteria do not relate to social relations in the mode of production, but to the terms of operative legal ownership. The bureaucracy does not legally own the means of production, therefore it is not a class. The USSR can only be a worker state, albeit a degenerated worker state, ruled by a bureaucratic stratum. Footnote. Nationalization equals socialism. Socialist relations of production are capitalist relations with a change in property form. See Avenas' Trotsky's Marxism and Revolution Betrayed in International Council Correspondence. I might have that on here. I'm not sure if it's a different thing, but I do have a review. I think I have a review by Paul Maddock on the Revolution Betrayed. I think that also might be titled like Lenin and Stalinism. I'm not sure. I'll have to check it out. One second. Where am I? Sorry. End footnote. Trotsky's suggested remedy, political revolution, thus assumes the existence of a socialist economy. In a classically reductionist manner, Trotsky determines the base to be satisfactory, the superstructure corrupt. Footnote. See the struggle against fascism in Germany. See further Krieger, Bureaucracy and Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism in Marion Sawyer's Socialism and the New Class. End footnote. The USSR is, quote, base, end quote, ickly socialist. The USSR is, quote, base, end quote, ickly socialist. Footnote. See further R.B. Day's Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation. If capital is a world system, how is it possible for the USSR to be free from its laws? Knai Paz, page 333, rebukes Day for economism, but the logic of Trotsky's position is national despite Trotsky's political denials. In Trotsky's theorization of permanent revolution, quote, the basic postulates, end quote, in permanent revolution, the procedure is 1. Permanent revolution in Russia, 2. International revolution. In the event of the failure of 2, Trotsky is forced back into 1. See also Writings 1935 to 36. End footnote. There are 2 central protests here. First, political. A worker state where workers are excluded from political power is a logical absurdity. Footnote. E.G. Shachtman in Trotsky's New Course. End footnote. Trotsky's worker state can only be a state nationalized, quote, on behalf of, end quote, the workers. Second, his analysis falters in the realm of political economy. The contention that relations of production are socialist, but those of distribution bourgeois, does violence to the basic Marxist principle that, quote, the structure, Gliederung, of distribution is completely determined by the structure of production, end quote. Grundrisse. Such a separation is the antithesis of Marx's critical political economy, in which, quote, every form of distribution disappears with a specific form of production from which that form of distribution descended and to which that form of distribution corresponds, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. End footnote. As Howard summarizes the problem, quote, a moment's Marxist reflection points to the inadequacy of Trotsky's notion of Russia as a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote. If in spite of everything Russia is still essentially a, quote, worker state, end quote, then the implication is that the elimination of private ownership and the replacement of the anarchy of capitalist production by the plan are the essence of socialism. The, quote, degeneration, end quote, would concern only the form, not the essence of the Russian social formation. But this confuses the juridical form of property with the actual relations of production themselves. For Marx, it is precisely these relations of production which determine the forms of distribution and their deformed superstructural reflection, end quote. Footnote. Dick Howard, The Marxian Legacy. See also his Introduction to Castoriadis in Telos 23. Dick Howard, I believe, also wrote a book on the history of Marxist economics, or Marxian political economy. End footnote. Finally, Trotsky's emphasis on distribution again indicates the presence of a distributive ethic. Footnote. See Revolution Betrayed and Avenos Part 2. These errors parallel some of Lenin's substitutionism, poor political economy, and socialism understood as material equality. Despite these basic mistakes in Trotsky's theory, it is to his credit that he concludes, quote, the question of the character of the Soviet Union is not yet decided by history, end quote. This position is followed up in the 1939 decision that the fate of the USSR is to be decided by the outcome of the war. If a radical reading of Trotsky is possible, it must focus on this period. For the present, let us note that Trotsky's position on the USSR reveals the limits of his historical method. His understanding of socialism barbarism allows only for the revival of socialist democracy or for totalitarianism. He sees the war as the closing of his 50-year conjuncture, introducing either socialism or destroying civilization. The problem is blurred by the fact that Trotsky sees acceptance of the, quote, third way, end quote, as endorsement of it as the, quote, only way, end quote. He understands bureaucratic collectivism as a road to converged theory, a non sequitur reminiscent of Korch. He understands bureaucratic collectivism as a road to convergence theory, a non sequitur reminiscent of Korsch. Trotsky seems to assume that to a certain extent the fate of the Western working class is sealed in the USSR, a type of Soviet centrism. The USSR sets the world pattern. World revolution depends on the Soviet Union's future, though on the other hand, world revolution can also save the USSR. Trotsky's position remains unelaborated, but the former notion, at least, is opposed to Western Marxism, for which socialist revolution remains an untried experience, dependent precisely on the popular masses of late capitalism. Coexisting with Trotsky's earthly view of socialism is another concept, socialism as paradise. There are elements of Marx's view here, the end of money, the state, division of labor, but there is more. As previously mentioned, Trotsky's vision in the last few pages of Literature and Revolution is one of hyperactive Superman socialists. Trotsky's error is not as unusual as it might at first seem. It is simply a refiguring of bourgeois humanism, or the inclination to view man as God the master. Man is essentially free and revolutionary. Man can move rivers and mountains, populate the peaks and the ocean beds, perfect the human body and its creations. See Trotsky's Literature and Revolution. These two concepts of socialism and Trotsky are remotely connected. The binding thread connecting the two is the notion of the rationality of domination. In his minimum concept, rationalization facilitates control of productive forces. In the maximum, socialism is understood as universal control, including the complete domination of nature. Trotsky's is a schizoid socialism in which these two concepts coexist. To use his own terminology, Trotsky lacks a transitional notion of socialism. The former concept becomes the immediate program, the latter a dream. Conclusions. The theory of permanent revolution, a profoundly ideological theory in the core of Trotsky's Marxism, is a clear contrast to the Marxism of Lenin. Unlike Trotsky, Lenin does not generally ideologize particular conjunctures, at least until the 21 conditions of the Comintern. Trotsky tends to rationalize or theorize all. Unlike Trotsky, Lenin does not generally ideologize particular conjunctures, at least until the 21 conditions of the Comintern. Trotsky tends to rationalize or theorize all in the name of the revolution. He is more the theoretician than Lenin, but this constitutes his major flaw in a situation in which theory does not lie with practice. In attempting to justify the expedient, Trotsky tends, particularly in the 20s, to justify incidentals theoretically. He lacks Lenin's flexibility. Where Lenin's tension is between theory and political flexibility, Trotsky's tension is one between orthodoxy and criticism. Because of this difference, it is easier to, quote, save Lenin than Trotsky, for flexibility is part of Lenin's practice. Where in Trotsky we find only textual flexibility in the early and late periods. This is not to say that Lenin was a good theoretician, but only that he was a good Machiavellian practitioner. Trotsky, in comparison, was neither. Seems like I missed a footnote here. See Frankfurt Critique, e.g. Habermas's Technology and Science as, quote, ideology, end quote, and Dunizhevskaya's piece, Leon Trotsky, seems to suggest that this, quote, duality, end quote, characterized here as, quote, schizoid, end quote, is the central theme of all Trotsky's work. She couples world revolution, defense of USSR, socialism as utopia plus socialism as USSR, proletarian vanguard plus militarization of labor, and so on. End footnote. Because of his lack of methodological rigor, Trotsky seizes on the worst elements of Marxist theory. Contemporary Trotskyism repeats and compounds this process. To better situate Trotsky's Marxism, consider his similarities with certain contemporaries. The parallel with Luxemburg has already been mentioned. Here we find all the elements of spontaneism, general strike, and so on. Trotsky also has something in common with the council tradition, a belief in the necessity of breakdown perceived as a show of revolutionary credentials. Footnote, see Russell Jacoby, The Politics of the Crisis Theory. I think that statement is really correct. Trotsky has also something in common with the council tradition, a belief in the necessity of breakdown perceived as a show of revolutionary credentials. That is something that I definitely see a lot of in like councilist theories, to kind of like this, like being like the most extreme form of catastrophism. In terms of how transition from capitalism to communism would be achieved. Right? A sort of laissez-faire approach to communist revolution, you might say. And footnote, this rationalism in Trotsky is linked to a certain technological determinism, perhaps prefiguring Khrushchev. Quote, if the further development of productive forces was conceivable within the framework of bourgeois society, then revolution would generally be impossible, end quote, Khrushchev. Oh, that's not Khrushchev, that's Trotsky. Trotsky, the first 5 years of the Communist International. Trotsky's faith in the onward march of productive forces inducing socialism is partially negated by the insertion of the party into the theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky's development here resembles Lukács. See Lukács' History and Class Consciousness and Habermas's Theory and Practice. In common, Trotsky and Lukács view the proletariat as a Hegelian actor. Though Trotsky does not theorize these problems, the two also share notions of false and imputed consciousness and the teleology therein. Subsequently, Trotsky and Lukács share not only workerism and automatism, but also partyism and substitutionism. Finally, the analysis of the later Trotsky resembles Korsch's convergence theory, socialism or barbarism read as barbarism or barbarism. Here, convergence signals the death of Marxism. See Douglas Kellner's Karl Korsch Revolutionary Theory. That entire book, both Kellner's Introduction to Karl Korsch and the political writings that contained in that book by Karl Korsch, are on this channel. End footnote. Trotsky and Korsch are combined on the methodological plane, though the absence of specificity might be a greater contradiction in Korsch, given the advocacy of it in his Karl Marx. Certain differences notwithstanding, Trotsky and Korsch together verge on replacing automatic revolution with automatic counter-revolution. What is interesting in these parallels is that Trotsky overlaps with the mistakes of the others and only rarely with their respective strengths. He mirrors either automatisms or idealisms, reversing these positions into disillusion in his last years. Again, the source of the problem is clearly methodological. Quote, rethinking, end quote, here owes more to impressionism than to a careful reconstruction of the specificities of a changing world. Trotsky's mass popular perspective ends with his acceptance of Bolshevism. He trades off his critical faculties for the necessities of history, resigning from critical thought until his last years and then engaging it only cautiously and partially. Trotsky's Marxism is paradigmatic of the dead weight of the past. Till 1917, Trotsky is dominated by the experience of 1905. In his last years, that of 1917. Before and after these periods, Trotsky's Marxism possesses some critical perspectives. In the terms of this critical position, the period of 1917 to 38 is a period of self-denial. Trotsky's relation to Marxism is determined less by reason than by the experience of history. Yet in his thought, rationalism and irrationalism coexist uneasily. The binding thread of this schizoid couple is an ideological reading of the notion that history and not theory is the ultimate social tribunal. Trotsky's antinomies are bound together by the historicist idea that Marxism is no more than the reception of Marx. The reduction of theory to history explains both Trotsky's Bolshevik victory and his disillusion with the oncoming war defeat. Both Trotsky's biography and his theory demonstrate Bolshevism's inability to perceive that consciousness is not necessarily consciously formed. How else can 20 years of self-denial be explained?